join us for the panel on the new socialism.
Which is a lot like the old socialism, unfortunately. Ask a conservative about socialism, and the first thing he'll say is, well, it doesn't work. But what if it did? What else do we object to?
Oh,
you're up, Crenshaw.
I'll take it. Because it relies on, I think, a faulty sense of values. So it relies on this idea that you don't really have to take responsibility for yourself. I think as conservatives, we should trace back every single policy, first through our politics, but first to our culture. I mean, that's the first thing. We always say this, politics is downstream of culture. I think policy is downstream of the politics. You got to get the culture right. And if you don't focus on responsibility for yourself, then by definition, you're assuming that other people should be responsible for you, and then you end up with a society full of irresponsible individuals who can't take care of themselves. That's the natural end state, and I fear that we're getting to that end state when I look at my generation and younger, where there's the belief that that's okay, where that's actually valued. I mean, so that's inherently why it's bad, because it's not sustainable.
Charles, what do you make of that?
Well, it doesn't work, so it's difficult to
Just
pretend it's like, saying, what if there were no gravity? But I think the bigger problem here is that the idea that socialism might work it invites us to pretend that socialism can be restricted to the economic sphere and that markets are purely economic in their consequences, and they're not. I mean, one of the reasons I'm in favor of free markets, which I think is a much better way of putting what we broadly in this room believe in than capitalism, is that I want people to flourish and be free and be unrestrained across a whole host of parts of their life, not just when they want to buy something, not just if they want to start a company, but in their speech, in their movement, and in their relationships within civil society. And although it is always promised it won't happen this time, socialism has a very bad record when it comes to those other elements in life, when it comes to free speech, when it comes to free association. I mean, if you see people coming together and starting businesses and civic organizations as a purely economic matter, I think you've missed half of our culture. It's not. One of the arguments in favor of free trade is that government shouldn't get in the way of two people who want to voluntarily transact. Now, in our trade disputes, that will be countries. But domestically, you have the same argument in favor of free markets. Why should I not be able to form a business or an organization with someone else? Why should the government, as true socialism calls for, control the commanding heights? Why should regulation determine every last detail of my relationship with you or you or you? And I think that one of the things conservatives need to get across against socialism is not just that it doesn't work, but that the cost of trying it is not just to GDP, it's not just to tax rates, it's not just to regulation, but it's also to every element of life in a voluntary society, in a society that is built around a civic culture, families, churches, local communities, and so forth.
Yeah, I think that if we could assume a world in which socialism works, which I don't even think we have a definition of what that means, you would have to create an apparatus of power to make it work. Right. And that in and of itself is a dangerous and corrosive and destructive thing. You can't have a totalist society without a totalitarian government, ultimately. That's just the way things go. And you can make that argument to these pinheaded kids on college campuses from time to time, and they will say, well, we're not talking about that. We're not talking about Venezuela, we're not talking about Cuba, we're not talking about North Korea. Socialism being, of course, the most unlucky philosophy in the history of political philosophies. There's nothing wrong with it. It just happens to throw up monsters and dictators everywhere it's done. They say, well, we're talking about Denmark, we're talking about Sweden, Norway, places like that, which of course, as we all know, are not actually socialist countries. They're countries that have very robust capitalist economies, in some ways superior economies to the United States, free trade, very, in many cases, liberal regulatory environment, that sort of thing. So do we take the people who are talking about socialism now seriously that they are actually talking about socialism itself, or are we talking about people who basically favor a larger, either American or European style welfare state, who want to make a public statement that says roughly, I'm radical?
The first thing I would say is that well-intentioned liberalism always leads to progressivism. There's no choice there. It has to, because when you start believing that, again, someone else should be responsible for you, and there's value in that, then you always have to do more. You always have to take another action, especially if you win that previous action. I mean, that's how government grows. That's why it's so hard for us as conservatives to shrink it again. Because once that action is taken, well, the only thing you can run on politically after that is more action. It eventually leads to totalitarianism. You have no choice. You know, it's okay. Yesterday we voted on the Equal Pay Act, and that the way that bill was structured was basically it allows an endless amount of bickering in the courts. Right, it's a great giveaway for trial lawyers. Right, that's how that mechanism would work. Just to create chaos in the market and amongst businesses. But if you really wanted to make that work, if you wanted to enforce equal pay, you would really, truly need a bureaucracy to actually enforce that, to your point. Like, you need a mechanism. And so, and it's this belief, and I think it comes from college campuses, because there's this belief, and maybe it's because they're on campuses with these really smart professors that these kids look up to, there's this belief that if you just get enough experts to think about it long enough, and give them all the control they need, and they can craft the perfect solution, right? They can go through every resume and decide exactly what's fair and exactly what you should be paid. You know, God forbid we let the market do that. The most hilarious thing about yesterday's debate on this, there was a motion to recommit. A motion to recommit is a wonky way of saying we wanted to amend their bill, and we said that we should cap the amount that trial lawyers would be able to make given those lawsuits that would take place. And the counter argument was, of course not. Trial lawyers know best what they should make. The market knows best what they should make.
Naturally, yes.
Yes! Thank you for that. It was, you guys really got to watch more C-SPAN. Sometimes there's some gems in there.
Yeah, when he uses the term wonky, some of you, I guess, will need to be reminded that he is in Congress and not just on Saturday Night Live.
Yeah, come on. Get some credit. I'm trying to build my brand.
Right, yeah.
I do read Kevin Williamson articles.
Oh, great.
And Charlie Cooke.
So, Charlie, do you take them seriously when they talk about socialism as such? Or do you think it's just a, you know how on the right there are people who call themselves libertarians just because they're conservatives who are embarrassed to call themselves Republicans? And not necessarily for bad reason.
Yeah, or conservatives who smoke weed is another definition.
Yes, that's true. Yes.
No, I mean, I think many of the people who are currently out there calling themselves socialists are not. I'm sure there are people who believe in socialism as traditionally defined, but the vast majority of those that make it onto magazine covers don't. No. And if you go back to England in the 1960s and 70s, we had one major party, the Labour Party, that was full of actual socialists. Now, I think these people were wrong in most of their views, and I think that they damaged the country a great deal. Thankfully, there was a reversal. But they were extremely smart, serious people. They were people who had studied the ideology to which they pledged fealty. They had theories of class, they had theories of economics, they had theories of power, they had theories of history. Again, they had wrong theories in my view, but they understood what they were talking about. Some of the giants of British politics in the 20th century understood what they were talking about. And I don't see that in this new socialism. There is a lot of sass in it. There is a lot of, well, if you like the post office, then you're a socialist, ha ha ha, which is not a serious argument. There is a lot of pointing at countries that are not actually socialist, Norway, for example, and saying that is what I want. There's a lot of downplaying of countries that have magically gone from being socialist to never being socialist, like Venezuela. It's a mess. The people who were actual advocates, practitioners of socialism, were not jumping on every fad. I mean, they had a coherent worldview. Now, you could see that as something of a victory, and I think we should in many ways. The fact that there is no great desire at the moment, even from the cheerleader of this supposed new socialism movement, Bernie Sanders, to nationalize everything. The fact that there is no great Marxist theory underneath Bernie Sanders' agenda should in some ways be seen as a good thing. But the incoherence is also dangerous, because once we lose sight of a language which is common to all participants, once we define terms so vaguely that it is impossible to determine quite what the speaker means, then we enter into a politics that is chaotic, and that can be dangerous. And I think that although there is a tendency perhaps to dismiss the various people who are calling themselves socialists because they're incoherent, the effect that they might have on our political discourse shouldn't be underestimated, because... Go on.
Oh, I was going to say, you know what I think this actually is? I think this is going to sound a little eccentric, but I think this is absolutely the case. It is the rediscovery of magic. If you've gone back and read books like James George Fraser's The Golden Bough, there is an ancient belief that if you can get the right people to say the right words in the right order, in the right context, that this changes reality, that this reshapes the world. And I think that when you read things like the Green New Deal and they say, well, if we just pass this thing, if we create this legislation, then we'll be able to do X, Y, and Z, like get rid of commercial airplanes. And you have to explain to them sometimes, even if you passed a law saying that we had to use the alternative technology for airplanes, it doesn't exist. There aren't any commercially viable electric or solar-powered international airliners. But there is a sense that if you talk about things in the right way, you say the right words, you write the right words down on a piece of paper, that changes the underlying reality. And I think that their battle is really with that underlying reality. We've got people who are unhappy for various kinds of reasons. They have economic complaints, they have social complaints, they feel like they have relatively little power compared to, say, big international corporations or very, very wealthy, billionaires and that sort of thing. And so they've taken up the banner of socialism in the belief that this is a leveling philosophy, that it will make things more equal. Now, of course, we all know from experience and from reading history that that's not actually the way socialism plays out, and they did murder 100 million people in the 20th century, so there was that. But they are, that dissatisfaction can't be written off, I don't think. And the sense of asymmetrical power that I think is really driving this is a real thing. And there are people on the right who are feeling this too. And in the Trump movement and some of the current populist rhetoric and politics, there is a pushback against that, against free trade, against the Silicon Valley technology companies, against so-called elites. Are we, in a sense, still talking about the same thing?
Yeah, I mean, first I want to say I am worried that they really do mean socialism a little bit more. I'm a little bit more pessimistic. Not that you're optimistic on it.
We don't allow that.
You guys, I listen to you guys a lot. You're not very optimist necessarily. That's why I like listening to you. But I do fear that they actually mean what they say. That's true. They haven't called for total nationalization of many parts of the economy. But they do say a lot of things that look a lot like Venezuela. They do talk about price controls, yep. Which were directly related to the travesty we see in Venezuela. So, they do talk about things that have really bad results and that are not found in the Nordic countries. Minimum wage, for instance. Nordic countries do not have as progressive as a tax system as we do, and they want to make it more progressive. They want much more than the Nordic countries even are right now. So I do feel that they mean what they say. And if you really read Democratic Socialists of America's website, they do say eventually want to do away with capitalism. And then, of course, now they've added cows and airplanes, like you said. Right. But to your original question of, how do we manage some of the discontent that we see in a responsible, conservative way? And I think there's meaningful policies that we can implement. But again, I also think I always go back to the culture war. It stems from this culture of feeling as if you are not empowered, all right? And the only way that you can feel unempowered is to believe that someone has power over you, and the only way you can feel that is through the rhetoric that we've seen coming out of the left. And that's why identity politics is so powerful. It pits you against somebody else. It allows you to feel as if you're a victim. And what we've also done in this society is elevated this idea of being a victim. We've elevated that status. Whereas I think maybe we feel like we all grew up, and I'm sure a lot of those in this room would agree that when we look to heroes who we think we look, people we want to be like, there's somebody who takes responsibility for themselves. They would shun the idea of being a victim. That's what I tried to do when somebody made fun of me, and I was like, I don't care.
Great Americans like Jussie Smollett.
Yeah, exactly. So the fact, exactly. I mean, the fact that he knew that would elevate him to a certain extent, the fact that Elizabeth Warren knew that if she wrote Native American on her resume, that would elevate her status, not diminish it, that's really significant. It leads to those identity politics. It leads to that cultural narrative. It leads to socialism. Again, it starts off well-intentioned. This is why I always say well-intentioned liberalism has to lead to these places eventually. Conservatives do have to do what you're saying, though, and take note of the issues that people are facing.
Right, and that's kind of what I'd like to speak to next. I think one of the great moments of stupidity in American politics in the last several years, and there have been quite a few of them to choose from, but the word deplorable sticks out in our political rhetoric now for a particular reason that doesn't require any further explanation. But the people on the left, the kind of Clinton people, the sort of more moderate Democrats, looked at the Trump movement and they said, whatever these people are mad about is something we don't care about. Either they're racist, or they've got other kinds of complaints, or they're just ignorant hicks, and there's nothing we can do for them. We don't have anything to offer them. We're just going to try to crush them politically, and that's going to be that. I fear that we are on the verge of replicating that error on our side. When we see people who are looking at candidates like Bernie Sanders, who are talking about socialism, who have rediscovered some populist and authoritarian ideas that should have been worn out long ago, and we just say, well, they're going to crazy colleges and we can't reach them, and one of these days they'll read Hayek or get a paycheck and that'll all change. But that's not going to happen, right? So what do we have to offer them? How do we go about looking at the insecurities and anxieties and complaints that this revival of socialism is based on, and address that from a conservative or libertarian point of view?
Well, my basic view on this is that we don't need a revolution in America because we already had one. And one of the problems that you have if you're a nation based on revolutionary ideas is that the day after the revolution, the revolutionaries become conservatives because they want to conserve the revolution. And I think that the broad philosophy that you will hear from this stage today and tomorrow is in and of itself a world-changing revolutionary idea. Individual liberty, equal rights. Now, America has obviously not always lived up to this, but the great figures who have complained about that have recruited those ideas in their complaint. Martin Luther King talked about a promissory note that he was owed and that he had been denied, and that millions like him had been denied. He didn't say, burn it all down. Martin Luther King was not a conservative in the way that I am, but he nevertheless understood that the North Star in America was an attractive one, was a commonly comprehended one, and held probably the best chance for equality and for justice. And I think that anybody who talks in revolutionary terms in America needs their head looking at, because the values that lead us not only to prosperity but to a strong civil society are already here. The other thing we have on our side, and this will sound facetious but I don't mean it to be, is reality. If you look at the restoration in Anglo-American countries, and indeed in Scandinavia, of classically liberal, libertarian, free market, individual values, they came as the result of failure. Now, it is not a particularly salutary idea that we just have to wait a little bit until everything goes to hell and then we'll win, finally. But there is something to it. I don't believe for a moment that Margaret Thatcher in 1979 won because, as Kevin said, everyone woke up and said, oh my goodness, I love this Hayek guy all of a sudden. She won because the opposition, the government at that point, was nuts. She lost.
Because it took 18 months to get a phone turned
It
on.
lost 18 months to get a telephone. You had to lie and say you were a doctor, and they might give you one in 3 months. There was trash piling up in the streets. There were bodies going unburied. You had 18% inflation.
It's like Cleveland.
Yeah. You had Kevin's now going to start insulting everyone by explaining how he hates all
Like
states.
Cleveland.
But it was a disaster. There were rolling blackouts. It was just deeply, deeply embarrassing. Britain was the sick man of Europe, and Margaret Thatcher said, I'm going to fix that. But by 1987, when she won her second victory in a landslide, a third victory in a landslide, there were a lot of people who said, you know, I actually think that she's right, and that the policies that she's been putting forward are right. And I think a similar thing happened in the United States. There was much more widespread appreciation of free markets and federalism and deregulation by the late 1980s than there was in 1980. But it took where the people with the wrong ideas, and in Jimmy Carter's defense, he actually had some of these good ideas as well. His administration started some of the deregulation, started some of the shift. But it took those bad ideas to create a space for the good ideas. Wage and price controls, you mentioned, have been disastrous in Venezuela. But wage and price controls were popular in the Nixon administration. There was a Republican policy in the 1970s. And that is unthinkable now for everyone except those on the fringes. So I think we ought to have some faith. The purpose, of course, of our trying to win these arguments is that we don't have to get there, because you don't want to lose that generation. But reality does kick in, and socialism doesn't work. So ultimately, reality is our friend as well.
You know, you're talking about the sort of inability to change policy once it's in there, because it's very difficult to overrule what's going on in terms of democratic inertia. Those of you who still have landlines may notice there's a tiny little tax on long-distance service. It's been there for a long time. And this is 2019. That tax was instituted as an emergency measure to help fund the Spanish-American War. And it's still there. Do something about that. Come on. One thing I think we've done ourselves a little bit of a disservice as conservatives, and I'd like to speak to this just a little bit, is if the left is unserious sometimes in what it's calling socialism, so are we. Whatever is going on in Western Europe and the Scandinavian countries is not actually socialism. It's typically liberal democratic welfare states that are larger and more onerous and more expensive than ours, but not really quite, not really socialism. We also sometimes describe, you know, things like the New Deal and some of those programs that way, and some of them were and some of them weren't. But, you know, there are some conservatives, myself among them, find a lot to like and admire about the way many European countries are governed. In some ways, their arrangements are more orderly than ours. I think that in some ways, Canada is a better governed country than the United States is. I think Switzerland's a better governed country than the United States is. Sweden's not a, you know, hellhole. Norway is a petro-emirate, so that's kind of a special case. But people look at these places and they say, well, you know, life in Denmark doesn't look horrible. It doesn't look like, you know, Cuba, and we tend to just sort of dismiss that and not speak to what it is they like about it. And I think one of the things that people are looking for, and Hayek, since we're talking about Hayek, which is inevitable because we always do, you know, he talked about insecurity. He talked about the dangers and developments in life that one cannot on one's own make adequate provision against. And this is the point of, you know, social insurance and these kinds of programs. And so the anxieties and the risk aversion, I think, and I think risk aversion is really the basic issue. Conservatives are less risk averse than progressives are, and we're willing to take more chances on markets and free institutions, that we don't speak to those anxieties in a useful way. And again, I think that was part of Donald Trump's success in 2016, in that the sort of movement that he was the center of, if not the origin of, speaks to some extent about that, to the idea of a partial solidarity politics, and this sense of, you know, we're on your side, Mr. You know, working class American, and that sort of thing. And I think conservatives often fail to do our duty and due diligence on those things. And am I wrong about that, or am I right?
No, I think in the Republican Party, there's now an uncomfortable coalition where you have some of that. Let's just call it somewhat. You know, let's just be optimistic. And it's a coalition between, I would say, an old Labor Party and this sort of the free market pro-business party. And that Labor Party used to be part of the Democrats, but the Democrat new culture has left them. I mean, left them entirely. Yeah. Just based on their rhetoric and their sort of fantasy world kind of politics and those magic words you were talking about. I mean, that doesn't speak to working class people because it sounds crazy, because it is. And so they came to Donald Trump, and you know, to figure out why, you almost have to talk to each one of them separately. And there's some good books written on that. But we do have that uncomfortable relationship now. I don't want to lose that coalition, but we also have to figure out how to include them and their concerns in a free market governing system. And you know, we have to be looking for ways to do that. I think, for instance, one of the things we talk about a lot is workforce training, because in the end, if you feel empowered, then you're going to feel good about your life. It's not necessarily poverty that makes you unhappy, right? There's a lot of very impoverished places that have a close community social fabric, and they're very happy as a result. So how do you empower people? How do you give them that sense of purpose, that sense of dignity through work? Like they feel like they're here on this earth for a reason, you know, and that comes from civic life, that comes from social fabric, and it comes from skill sets that work in this new economy, which we can't really change. And trying to promise to change it, as the president did, maybe unfairly, that's not a good promise to make. So I think now we have to be talking about policies that actually work towards that. And I talked about one. But I think that's the best. That's what we have to. We have to keep that coalition together.
Charles?
I agree with you mostly, but I also think we just have to accept that we have our work cut out, because so many of the answers to questions that are posed to free marketeers run along the lines of I don't know. It is a philosophy in many ways that is based on I don't know. And in so many elements, so many parts of our society, we now accept this, and which is good. I mean, for example, there are very few people writing terrified op-eds about who is going to make underwear, for example. I mean, that is not a question the government is asked to answer. I don't know, but someone will. There'll be a company, it'll make it, and there'll probably be lots of companies, and they'll all sell it, and it will get cheaper and cheaper and better and better. In politics, though, we have a couple of problems. The first is that there are some goods and services that people are panicked about, and for good reason, healthcare, for example, where I don't know is less convincing, even in the cases where I don't know is actually a good answer. And in a TV-driven, nationalized, sensationalist era, I don't know can become a liability, especially when one's opponent says, I do know. I mean,
You're telling me.
And I have a plan.
And I have a plan. I mean, if you think...
Action. It's always
right.
action.
If you think, I mean, this doesn't happen because this is so difficult, but if you just imagine a hypothetical argument or debate between, say, a free market type, maybe a free market absolutist, and a moderate center-left political candidate. The free market absolutist, even though he would be right about so many things, would have his work cut out, because the audience would ask questions that wanted concrete answers. Hi, I'm a 32-year-old IT programmer from Wisconsin, and I've just had my second child, and my wife works in the local hospital, but her hours have been cut, and as a result, we have a problem with childcare. What are you going to do about that? And it is very easy in that circumstance for a politician to say, right, here's my 10-point plan, and if you look at we're going to work with the state agencies, and we're going to increase this training program. And if your ultimate answer to the question is reform the system so that the incentives are in place so that eventually this will work out better for you, and hopefully along the way create an economy in which jobs are higher paying and more meaningful, you haven't really given an immediate answer to that person who is, for a good reason, worried about their life, even if you are right in the long run. So I agree with you that there is a blind spot here, and I also think the uneasy coalition that you discussed is a problem here. But I also think that the more we sensationalize our politics, which is what we've done for decades, the less easy it is going to be to say, I don't know the answer to that. I can't know the answer to that. My job is to create the framework within the people who do know the answer to that can thrive.
I found there was a little bit of space for that campaigning, for brutal honesty. On a national level, it is hard to see. It is hard to see when you're on CNN and MSNBC and even Fox trying to debate those things. People want action. It's a natural human tendency, and the left takes advantage of it brilliantly. And it is hard to compete with. We have to know more. We have to be ready more. We have to have more in-depth arguments, because they will use inch-deep arguments that feel really good.
Do you think arguments really matter in this? And this is an honest question. A lot of this, I think, is just tribal signaling. I'm a member of this group, you're a member of that group. And because if you, outside of a few, intellectuals and policy professionals and things like that, if you start asking people questions about this, you get the retreat into vagueness really very quickly. And then the conversation always turns to, well, what about the other guy, right? It's never about, this is our agenda. And this happens on the right, too. This is what we want to do. This is our plan. This is our daft Green New Deal. This is our moonshot, whatever it is. They don't want to get too much into the details of that, of course, but then, well, these other people are racist. These other people are, sexist, homophobes, transphobes, what have you. And we do a fair bit of that on the right, too, where, it's our defense mechanism is, well, what about the other guy? And so to that extent, I'm not sure that arguments are going to really be that effective. And of course, arguments are really all we have. Is there another way of going about this, of taking these people who are walking around with iPhones in their hands, hating capitalism, and trying to help them understand the nature of the world in which they actually live?
Yeah. I guess it depends on your definition of arguments. I mean, maybe arguments with a 9-point policy plan aren't as effective, but rhetorical arguments are. It's all we've got. Like you said, it's all we have. We don't have much else. So there's arguments, I think, in the way that we would make arguments, in the way that both of you write about. I do think that's effective, but you have to fight on the culture war front, and that's a whole new world, right? And a lot of my colleagues they're like, what do you mean by culture war? You have to fight on this battleground that a lot of the older politicians are not used to fighting on. And maybe a lot of people in this room don't even understand what I'm talking about when I say culture war. So it depends on what front of that culture war, but I'll give you one example. There's an entire movement in America that just doesn't like America, period, that thinks America is founded on some kind of evil ideology, and that it should be, and that alone is enough to undercut any idea that a conservative, somebody who wants to conserve American ideals, is wrong. And so an example of that, and I shared this social media video a little while ago. It's a woman out in California who used to work for the Santa Barbara Community College, and I guess she no longer worked there. And she was upset that when they did hearings, they no longer said the Pledge of Allegiance for whatever reason they had. And she was protesting that as she was testifying to that hearing. And as she was saying her piece, and she took up a little flag and said the Pledge of Allegiance, there was protesters there who must have known she was going to be there and just viciously screamed at her. And she has tears in her eyes as she's trying to give the Pledge of Allegiance. And that's the culture war. Like that's the perfect example of this, and it's vicious, it's gross what's happening. It's a culture of And in the capitalism versus socialism debate, you're right. It's not exactly about arguments and 100 million people dead and whether price controls are a good thing. It is really a culture war deep down. And it's a culture war which, again, go back to how I initially stated this, it is about whether personal responsibility should be valued or whether it should not.
Yeah.
If you want to know, by the way, why Kevin is unemployable, consider that he just proposed that ideas don't matter at an ideas summit.
Hard truths, man.
This is his last day at National Review.
Teller of hard truths, and I'm going to figure out how to make a low foam latte, and that'll be that. On that front, by the way, a question from the audience, which I think is a good and relevant one. There is a person of whom some of you may have heard who is called Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and she is recently elected to the House of Representatives, even though she doesn't seem to know what the House of Representatives does. And or like how a bill becomes law.
Tell us how you really feel.
Things. Well, So anyway, someone asks, the face of socialism is now AOC. Can you discuss the relationship between feminism and socialism? Which I think is actually an interesting question, because I think both of these speak to my earlier observations about risk aversion. There's some interesting studies on this. If you look at, for instance, women's investment habits, a woman with the identical income to a man will tend to invest her money more conservatively, to take on less risk. And there's a great deal of evidence, I think, that the people we think of as being part of the progressive coalition, African Americans, Latinos, women, are risk averse. And I think feminism speaks to that in a sense as well, of women who believe that their place in the world is not entirely secure. They require certain kinds of accommodations and assistance, or changes in institutions and that sort of thing. So I don't think that it's at all coincidental that these things go together. What do you think?
Well, I'm not. I think a lot of what you just said is true, but it is obviously also the case, and we can see that if we look around, that a lot of women are also risk-taking and conservative. My wife is somewhere to the right of Attila the Hun, and makes me look like a squish. So I don't know, Kevin. I think there is a growing tendency on the left, and especially the younger progressive left, toward this idea of intersectionality that is essentially in practice leads people to sign up to everything that the broad left is putting forward. Now, in some cases, that's because there is an actual theory there as to how people who are at the bottom of the hierarchy of victims need to stick together. But in other cases, it's just clever politics. It's quite destructive politics because it leads to people not calling out those with whom they're allied when they do terrible things. And I think you're seeing some of this with the anti-Semitism problems over the last few weeks. But it is also quite clever politics because it stops infighting. And so, I tend to see the alliance that you're describing there more in the way that I see, for example, Planned Parenthood tweeting about how net neutrality is a core issue, or the ACLU moving away from being a civil liberties organization and toward being a general left-leaning organization.
Charles, and if Planned Parenthood switched to net neutrality full-time, no one would be better pleased than I.
But, and you see a bit of it on the right as well. The National Rifle Association has become far more of a general right-wing outlet in the last 5 years, and there is a tendency to go along and get along between the two parts of the rights coalition at the moment. So, yes, I'm sure that's some of it, but I also think that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is somebody who has picked up every single left-of-center idea and run with it. There's not a single one that she has rejected. She is not heterodox in any way. And so, yeah, she's got socialism and feminism together, but she's also got all of the other isms together, because that's the best way to build a coalition and to elevate herself.
Yeah.
Hard to write legislation that way, though, isn't it? One of the things that seems to me particularly dopey about the Green New Deal is lumping in a bunch of things together that are all pretty complex on their own and trying to treat them as a single unitary phenomenon, which is bonkers.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much time we should really devote to it. It's a bad science project. Sometimes the president really nails it with his descriptions of things. Yeah. It was like a failed science project. And listen, but it is important to understand why they do these things, because they operate from a premise of crises all the time. Yes. Okay, so if you do believe that the world is ending in 12 years, then there's really no cost too high. If like yesterday, what we voted on, if you do believe that women are actually paid 80 cents on the dollar, there's no cost too high to trying to fix that. Today, what we voted on, if you believe that transgender people are truly discriminated against in the military, and if you believe that the president's policy is actually a ban on them, which by the way is a huge lie, that's not actually what the president's policy is, but if you believe that, you're willing to believe anything center or left, then you'll just vote on it, and there's no cost too high. If you believe that inequality is the greatest crisis that the world has ever seen, then socialism starts to sound pretty good.
Do we care about inequality? Because I don't.
No,
I don't.
Well, it's an important point. You care about poverty.
No, I care about poverty, right.
Right, so if the standard of living is generally going up, which it has been for a long time, I don't care if there's more distance at the top and the bottom than there was 20 years ago, 30, which isn't true, by the way. I mean, if you want to draw the line of history back far enough, there's a lot of inequality in the Middle Ages, as it turns out, and
Well,
capitalism has gotten rid of a lot of that.
You end up with the implication in that book by Thomas Piketty that everyone liked, that the First and Second World Wars were actually quite good because they lowered income inequality.
Right.
Which is, they did, but I mean,
So
at
would a
what
meteor.
cost? Right, well, so would a meteor, exactly.
No,
I would just disagree with one thing slightly. You said that if you really believe that there's a crisis, there's no price too high. I personally think that if you really believed the world was going to end in 12 years, they would have put together a completely different proposal, one that actually had a chance of passing. I mean, I think that in some sense, this is a sign of a total lack of seriousness. If you genuinely think we are doomed, you don't say, right, what do we want to stop this? How about a $32 trillion nationalized healthcare plan, which is the first thing in there.
Yeah.
And FDR did not say, we've got to beat this Hitler guy. What do you want? I don't know, let's repaint all the buses, right? They were very, very focused because it was an existential threat. This is not me disparaging people who believe strongly in climate change. I'm disparaging their approach. And then when you point out that this is a silly idea, they say you don't believe in climate change. So, I mean, you know, if I
I'll
were...
believe
They
that
also
they
ban
believe
nuclear.
what they're saying when I can afford a house in Malibu.
Yeah.
Right.
Because
Well,
these
that's
rich
another
progressives
point.
are not selling their oceanfront property.
No, and like they get very angry too when you point out that truth. I mean, you saw the video of AOC this week. She went off in this impassioned speech about it, you know, because the criticism was, well, that's an elitist. This is an elitist deal. The Green New Deal is for elites who live in their high rises in New York City and see a dirty world around them because they're in New York City. And they're like, God, the world's about to end. And she's like, you know, and she talks about asthma and things. And I always say, well, New York City can pass a Green New Deal and get rid of all cars and farting. Well, I don't think they have cows, but they do import a lot of meat. And, you know, they can do it. Like, why not try it? Why not try it?
Do you know there's something like 147 addresses in Manhattan that are receiving farm subsidies?
That's insane.
Yeah.
We'll work on that.
Yeah.
Skyscraper farming might become a thing.
Well, at least those people will be above the waterline when the floods come. That'll be,
You're going to need to get re-elected just to run through the list Kevin's writing.
right. Keeping you busy.
You've got 2 years.
It's very demanding at National Review.
Right. But I think to go back to the slightly more serious conversation, there is a belief on the left that economic inequality, which is a fancy way of saying some people have more money than others and some people earn more money than others, or don't earn it, they inherit it, whatever, is necessarily a form of political inequality. That it creates power disparities that have you know, deep, long-ranging political consequences. I'm not sure that I've actually seen a ton of evidence of that, and to the extent that there is evidence of it, Brian Kaplan, among others, have shown this, that it tends to help libertarians and progressives more than it does conservatives when wealthy people prevail statistically more in their political views than poor people or middle-class people. Do we think that that is an idea worth addressing, that economic inequality is something that has a necessary political consequence it's worth thinking about from a policy point of view?
Well, I mean, you can admit that inequalities of sorts create sort of, I think, you know, a civil unrest to a degree. But the answer is not attack the rich. See, the left gets very confused and they get distracted because they hate the rich so much that they forget that maybe if we just focused on poverty and the poor and making sure that people can climb that ladder, that would be 100% of our attention versus the 50-50. And it almost seems like it's more like 80-20, 80% on the rich focused as opposed to 20% on making sure you can climb that economic ladder. That would be a more useful way to use our time and resources. As far as how it affects the politics, I mean, you know, this is the basis of HR 1. So HR 1 is the, what do they call it, the For the People Act. We call it the For the Politicians Act, because if I wanted a great system that a guy like me could get reelected in really easily, I'd love HR 1, because it's really for people who have a decent social media following, who I can raise a lot of small dollar donations, and then, oh, look at that, the federal government matches it 6-1. Well, that's a pretty good deal. I mean, you know, I can leverage a lot of volunteers because I have name ID. I'm an incumbent. Yeah. It's really a kind of a nefarious bill that I think everybody should look into and
I think the reason for the focus on the rich rather than the poor is that we're talking about European socialists, and European socialism is kind of is an intellectual movement with a philosophy. American progressivism is an enemies list. It's, we don't like these people, we don't like those people, we don't like this kind of business, and we should do what we can to go after them and inconvenience them and lower their status and diminish their...
Based on identity politics.
But it's also based on a misunderstanding of how the tax system currently works. And the vast majority of federal taxes are paid by the rich. It is not the case that we have a system in which poorer people are paying all of the taxes and rich people are riding around on their yachts. That is not how the United States currently works. If you look at the proposals, we're talking about AOC, so that 70% proposal, that is not going to fix this issue.
It's $700 billion over 10 years. We've done the math.
It's if you get the money, but you won't, because people will get paid in different ways. They'll get around it because rich people have more resources. Is that fair? No, it's not. But they're already paying huge amounts of the tax burden.
Yeah, I suppose we should point out that the Northern European welfare states, and to some extent the Western European welfare states that these so-called socialists admire so much, they're different from the United States, not in that they have higher taxes on the wealthy. Their taxes on the wealthy are about where ours are. They have radically higher taxes on the middle class.
Yes,
they do. 40, 50, 55% in some of these places at relatively modest levels of income. But that never works its way into our discussion. At least it hasn't in 20 or 30 years.
I tweet about it.
No, but this is a huge structural problem.
I mean, in the sense that people who want to carry forward these programs never really come out and say, oh, and we're also going to have to tax the middle class 50%.
And that's why I point out that $700 billion. So we have a graph, actually, the Budget Committee put this out. It was the cost of all their programs, and we didn't even include Green New Deal. We just included everything else, $53 trillion over 10 years, and a 70% tax on the 10 millionth dollar. $700 billion. It's very obvious mathematically you have to tax the middle class. And the thing I always point out in these hearings too is the simple question of why government exists. Like, if you believe that government exists so that your group of experts can implement these well-intentioned, benevolent programs that you want to do all the time, well then you should tax to the greatest extent mathematically possible everyone that you can. But if you believe government exists to protect the inalienable rights of people, then you want to tax people the least amount possible in order to protect those rights.
So this is a problem I think the Democratic Party has. And this will sound like what they call concern trolling, but this is a genuine structural problem they have at the moment, given their coalition. We talked a bit about the stresses on the right. As was just established, the big difference between the United States and, say, Britain, Australia, other Anglosphere countries, New Zealand, Canada, is not that there are no high rates or higher rates for richer people. The difference is that the rates kick in later. So in Britain, you start paying 40% of your income quite early. If you earn under £100,000, you're paying 40% of your income on the income above that level. That is broadly true in New Zealand, Australia, and Canada too. In fact, it's worse in New Zealand. That is justified in those countries and by many American progressives by pointing to the things you get for the money. So they will say, okay, fine, those people who earn less money are being taxed more, but they get a year's worth of government-paid child leave, they get single-payer healthcare, so on and so forth. That is a reasonable argument. It's an argument I disagree with. I don't think America is on that path. I don't think it can work within a federal system such as this one. But it is a reasonable argument. The problem is that no Democrat is actually proposing doing that. Simultaneously, the commitments are, we want Medicare for all, we want free college, we want child tax credits that are paid for from general revenues, we want to increase Social Security payments, is one that's popping up. And we will only tax the rich, and the rich start, depending on who you talk to, about $250,000 a year in income. But that math doesn't add up. Now, there was actually an opportunity here, I think, for someone who was new into Congress, who was not beholden to the establishment, who was willing to buck the trend, to say, I am not going to make that promise. I'm going to say, we're going to tax the middle class, we're going to change the way the country works, we're going to provide generous benefits that are administered by the government. That's my proposal. But it hasn't happened. And I think that's because the Democratic constituency is made up of people who would rebel. There probably aren't enough people who vote Democrat to prevent that from becoming toxic at an election and handing the contest to the other side. And that is a very big structural problem. Now, Republicans have the opposite problem, of course, which is that they can't actually cut government spending in the way that they want to, because increasingly those who vote for Republicans are happy with the way it is. Elderly Americans tend to favor Social Security and Medicare spending. You can't really win Florida if you say you're going to slash them. Yep. Likewise, people who have come from the Democratic Party, who are not wealthy, who are not country club Republicans, they are in favor of quite a lot of social spending too. So Republicans have the opposite problem. But I think one of the reasons it doesn't get done is not because the rich have bought off the politicians. It's because the Democratic Party is not willing to go through with the policies it would need to get there for fear of losing its current constituency.
I want to say something about elections too. I've had 3 of them now, and 1 year. I've never been in politics before that. And who buys you off and how that works. You know, it's a complete misunderstanding that I think the general population misunderstands this. So corporate PAC money, right? I think the panel before this was maybe on that. There's this, again, that's what HR 1 is. You know, it says you're just going to get rid of corporate PAC money. For my campaign, you can take a maximum of $5,000 from a corporate PAC. And then you have to explain to me why a group of people can't pool their money together and advocate for something in a highly transparent way, probably the most transparent way you can do it. It's funny when they talk about dark money, because I look up my opponent's FEC reports and it says no one's name. It just says act blue, act blue, act blue, act blue. You know, you can dig into it and figure out who it is, but that's not transparency. You know, this idea that people buy you off is nonsense. And the other reality is that PACs generally meet with politicians they already agree with. That's the truth. And the other major truth is, and the American people have to deal with this truth, is that the only reason money matters is because we're using that money to market to you. And if you didn't need that marketing, if you just went to my website, I wouldn't have to market to you and money wouldn't matter. No, everybody's always trying to blame everybody else.
Yeah, $5,000 won't even cover gas money campaigning in Houston. You gotta drive a lot there.
Right.
Yeah. You know, we talk about taxing the rich. I'm always reminded of Megan McArdle's observation that in Washington, rich means anyone who earns a little bit more money than a journalist does. So we have 2 minutes and 30 seconds left. So I'll give each of you half of it, if you'll watch the clock there. What should we say to these young socialists who think that they are going to be manning the barricades in the name of their philosophy?
I would say, my promise to you, young people, is that I'm not going to buy you off. I'm not going to try and buy you with promises that I can't keep. I'm not going to try and promise you extensions to these giant government programs that are actually putting you in debt. So you were talking about mandatory spending a second ago. We talk about it a lot on the budget committee as we make the argument that it's mandatory spending that is driving the country into wild amounts of debt, while the Democrats pretend that history began 2 years ago and that it's the tax cuts that are causing our debt. Okay, mathematically, I think we win that argument. But that is
racist.
Math is that was my train of thought. But that's how we reach young people, right? Like most liberal young people that I speak with, when I talk about Social Security reform, you know, when I go to the senior living homes, it's a little bit of a different story. They become wildly less conservative when I talk about the needs for Social Security reform and Medicare reform. The president's recent budget has some pretty good reforms to Medicare that actually don't really even change how the consumer even consumes it, but didn't touch Social Security. You know, that's a problem. I think we have to make those hard decisions on Social Security. Young people are. When I talk to them, I campaign on this quite a bit. I put it in my flyers, which is like, you're not supposed to do that, but we did. So simply saying that innovation is what we need. I want you to be free. They tend to lean more libertarian than we might think. All right, they want to smoke their weed and they want to do a lot of other things, but freedom, innovation, we're not going to buy you off. You can take care of yourself because you're awesome. You're a millennial. Woo.
Charles?
I like that he pointed at me when he said, you want to smoke your weed. I don't have very long, so I'll just say one of the things that I've thought for a long time, and I am always trying to get across when I do speak on college campuses, is that socialists are not the rebels manning the barricades, they're the man. Is that the rebels in this analogy are the free marketeers, the people who believe in free speech, people who believe in free association, people who believe in free trade. They are not the people with the bayonets, they are not the people with the indictments, they are not the people with huge buildings with logos on the side, department of this, bureaucracy of that. Socialism is the man, and free markets and limited government is the rebellious position.
That's a good one.
Thank you all so much.
I'm going to use that. Yeah, I like that. Really an honor. Thank you very much.